Warning: the following video contains less computer stuff and more paper-based game stuff than my usual videos. If you happen to have a paper allergy, you might want to check out one of the other 100 plus videos on my channel. Hi, it's Robin. As my neighbor says, how's you going, eh? When I was a kid growing up in the 80s, I think Steve Jackson was my favorite game designer, or at least his name was on so many of my favorite things. There were the brilliant Fighting Fantasy Gamebook series written by Steve Jackson and his friend Ian Livingstone, and they published dozens of these adventure game books. Some of these books were turned into games for my favorite computer, the Commodore 64, and also the ZX Spectrum. This is from the Commodore 64 version of Citadel of Chaos. Then there was the Car Wars tabletop game. Here's the mini Car Wars that I bought at Games-A-Lot in Toronto for $1.50 back in the 80s. And here's the deluxe edition of Car Wars by Steve Jackson Games. There's Steve Jackson's Sorcery series of game books that were like Fighting Fantasy. They had a more advanced spell system with a dedicated book and an even more detailed world and an epic multi-part story. And there was Steve Jackson's GURPS, the generic universal role-playing system, and my favorite in that gaming system is Autoduel, which is a more detailed RPG system set in the world of Car Wars. And then GURPS Autoduel was turned into a computer game, one of my favorites, and ported to the Commodore 64, Amiga, and many others. As it says, a futuristic, fast-paced strategy role-playing game by Lord British and Chuckles, based on the Car Wars board game by Steve Jackson. And Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone founded Games Workshop, probably most famous for their game Warhammer 40,000, or as the kids say today, 40K. I was especially fond of their board game version of the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. And Games Workshop also got into publishing games such as BattleCars, here for the 48K Spectrum. Eventually I started noticing some inconsistencies. For example, why would Steve Jackson start Games Workshop with his friend Ian Livingstone, and then they would make a game like BattleCars, which seemed to be totally ripping off Car Wars? Why would Steve Jackson compete with himself? And then why would Steve Jackson be writing Car Wars adventure game books, like Battle Road here, that get published by TSR, while his friend and business partner Ian Livingstone was writing books like Freeway Fighter for their Fighting Fantasy game book series? And finally, I discovered that there are two of them.
Oh, there's two of them.
Yes, there are two Steve Jacksons that make role-playing games, game books, tabletop games, strategy games, and sometimes computerized versions of those games. There is Steve Jackson from the UK, born in 1951, who founded Games Workshop and also created the Fighting Fantasy book series with Ian Livingstone. And there is Steve Jackson from the US, born just a couple years later in 1953, who founded Steve Jackson Games, creating Autoduel, OGRE, Illuminati, Munchkin, and many more. Maybe those of you who grew up in the United States or the United Kingdom weren't confused by this, but here in Canada, we were pretty much equally influenced by both the UK and the US in the 1980s. We would get lots of UK books at the bookstore, such as Fighting Fantasy. And at the games shop, we got lots of American games like Car Wars alongside Games Workshop games. So today we'll be looking through some of my favorite things that both Steve Jackson's, UK and US, have made over their prolific careers, and some of the other connections that exist between them and their companies. So look a little bit more at this Fighting Fantasy game book series. The first one was the Warlock of Firetop Mountain, and it was written by both Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone together. Unfortunately, I don't have the original edition of the first book, but I do have some of the other ones here. So for the next several books, Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone wrote them individually and published them together in the same series. So Steve Jackson wrote The Citadel of Chaos for Book 2, Ian Livingstone, The Forest of Doom for Book 3, which was actually the very first fighting fantasy I ever bought. Steve Jackson wrote book number 4, Starship Traveler, branching off into sci-fi. Book 5 is City of Thieves by Ian Livingstone. This is a later edition again. Book 6, Death Trap Dungeon. Book 7, Island of the Lizard King. Now you might think the confusion between Steve Jackson and Steve Jackson is just because they're both successful game designers and authors with the same name. Maybe it's not just me who confused Steve Jackson with Steve Jackson. But there's even more reason to be confused. Fighting fantasy books were hugely successful. Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone couldn't keep up with the demand for their books, so they started having additional authors write books for the series. And starting with book 8, those went under this banner of Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone Present. And who did they have write this first book? Of course, Steve Jackson.
This is getting out of hand.
Yes, Steve Jackson UK had Steve Jackson US write Scorpion Swamp, the first guest author for the Fighting Fantasy series.
Now there are 2 of them.
In fact, he wrote 3 books in total: Scorpion Swamp, Demons of the Deep, Book 19, and Robot Commando, Book 22. So it's almost impossible to tell that it's a different Steve Jackson, but here in Robot Commando, dedicated to my grandparents, E.B. and Bonnie Lairmore, who are Steve Jackson US's grandparents. The Fighting Fantasy books are similar to Choose Your Own Adventure books. Here's the first 3, The Cave of Time, Journey Under the Sea, and By Balloon to the Sahara. But Fighting Fantasy books are quite a bit longer. The story is split up into these paragraphs that branch, and they make very good use of all the space, at the possible risk of spoiling the story as it branches here. The path forks. If you wish to walk east, turn to paragraph 130. If you'd rather continue north, turn to 306. Fighting Fantasy also focuses on a richer single path. There is branching, but it all generally follows one story in most cases. While Choose Your Own Adventure tends to branch off into very wildly different endings, depending on what paths you choose. Sometimes they're even inconsistent with themselves. But probably the most important difference is that Fighting Fantasy actually has a game system that involves stats, like your skill, stamina, and luck, dice rolls to resolve combat, and you get an adventure sheet where you keep track of your monster encounters and even inventory. There's my writing from when I was like 11 years old. Citadel of Chaos got adapted as a C64 game. Unfortunately, it's not all that great. They went with an overly literal translation of the game that's kind of ponderous. I'd actually just rather read the book. Certainly could have been done a lot better. Other titles were adapted for the C64 and Spectrum, such as The Forest of Doom, Seas of Blood, Rebel Planet, and Temple of Terror. So now to look at Car Wars by Steve Jackson Games in the US. This is a tabletop game, not really an RPG, more of a board game or strategy game. This particular version is the deluxe edition. This is the version I played the most with my friends. Comes with a big rule book. Way back in 1996, when I was on the internet, I found Steve Jackson Games had printed this errata for deluxe Car Wars, so I printed it, and it's been stuck it in here. So it's a very large rule set. Explain all the rules about moving your car and attacking, weapons. It's quite a rich and detailed game. In this version of the game, cars are represented by these counters, and this key is used to help you decide how to move your counters around the maps, which does a fairly realistic job of simulating actual vehicles driving, ramming into each other, and so on. And the system saw lots of expansions, such as Car Wars Tanks, tank running over a poor old car, Boat Wars, Dual Track, adventure packs such as Midville, Mean Streets, City Blocks, and there was a quarterly magazine called Autoduel Quarterly that changed formats over the years sometimes. Steve Jackson himself often wrote for it. And there were other versions of the game, such as Car Wars, the card game, which was really fun to just pick up and play, and other editions of the game, such as this 5th edition Car Wars from the early 2000s. That was an attempt to streamline the game. Changed the scale of it quite a bit, though. Now, you might think Car Wars is inspired by Mad Max, but actually the world is quite different. It's not nearly as apocalyptic. Civilization hasn't broken down nearly as badly in the world of Car Wars. And in fact, Mad Max really wasn't the inspiration for Car Wars at all. It was actually Alan Dean Foster's short story called Why Johnny Can't Speed that is totally the inspiration for the world of Car Wars. A world where cities are still very civilized, but drivers on the highways in between are pretty much left to their own devices, and police don't interfere. A USA where you can go to your mechanic and have the guns mounted on your car serviced and reloaded. Another series from Steve Jackson UK is the Sorcery series. That's the 1st edition version that I have. I have this later reprinting of all 4 books. As I mentioned, it's a lot like Fighting Fantasy, except there's a whole book dedicated to the spells. And there's a lot of them. And all 4 books in the series form one very large story. And the final book in the series has 800 paragraphs. A regular Fighting Fantasy book only has 400 usually. And we put the whole series together. It's an adventure that's many times longer than a Fighting Fantasy book, truly deserving of the word epic. And here's the series BattleCars by the Games Workshop, which very much is Games Workshop's answer to Car Wars, but it didn't catch on very well. There was this Battle Bikes expansion, which unfortunately just reused the same art. Again, a system with many counters. It's pretty neat that it did get ported to the Spectrum. Here's BattleCars on cassette, as you might expect, and includes the keyboard overlays for 2 players at once, and the instruction book. And here's a little look at the gameplay. Thanks very much to Karsten Lervad for recording this footage for us on his Spectrum Next. And of course, when there were official Car Wars game books made, I had to get them. Steve Jackson US himself wrote the first couple in the series, and then other authors wrote the rest. And it's interesting that they were published by TSR. I guess for whatever reason, Steve Jackson didn't want to publish them himself through his company, but TSR themselves were making Dungeons & Dragons adventure books, as they called them themselves. Again, like Choose Your Own Adventure, but set in the Dungeons & Dragons world. And then Steve Jackson US, as I was mentioning, made GURPS, Autoduel. I especially like this series of the American Autoduel Association Road Atlas and Survival Guide, which I picked up in all kinds of hobby shops on various trips and so on. Got that one marked down to $2. And each of these goes through describing what the world of Car Wars is like in different parts of the world, mostly focused on the US. Here's the East Coast of the US, the West Coast, the South. Volume 4 goes over to Australia. Volume 5, the Midwest, almost gets up to me in Thunder Bay there. Volume 6, the Free Oil States. And Volume 7, Mountain West, which I think is the last of the series. GURPS has other aspects to it, which resulted in a raid on Steve Jackson games by the U.S. Secret Services back on March 1st of 1990. Steve Jackson had a BBS called Illuminati, based on one of his games, and they were working on a new module for GURPS called GURPS Cyberpunk, and a combination of things led the U.S. Secret Service to think that Steve Jackson's company were involved in illegal computer hacking, and they carried all of Steve Jackson's computers, including those that contained his game, and they carried them away and would not return them. If you want to read more about that, this book by Bruce Sterling called The Hacker Crackdown has that and many other interesting stories. I just finished reading that again. One of my all-time favorite C64 games is Ultima 4 Quest of the Avatar by Lord British, published by Origin Systems, Lord British's company. But even here, Steve Jackson US has multiple connections. For example, Origin developed and published OGRE, All-Out War Against a Juggernaut Fighting Machine on the Nuclear Battlefields of Tomorrow, based on the OGRE board game by Steve Jackson. And this is some footage from my Atari ST, which I don't think I've ever shown on my channel before. Sorry it's a bit fuzzy. My only way of recording my ST is over RF. In the 21st century, where battlefields are dominated by speedy hovercraft and heavily armored tanks that hurl tactical nuclear devices across miles of crater and rubble-strewn terrain, there is one tank that is more terrifying than all the others, the OGRE. The OGRE is a cybernetic tank, a fighting machine completely controlled by computers, a killer robot with a passionless intelligence that knows everything about efficient destruction and nothing about fear or mercy. And of course, Origin also published Autoduel, as I mentioned, one of my all-time favorite games. And here's a bit of footage of the C64 version. Probably the very first open world kind of game I ever played, where you can freely wander around the world. Each town has a unique layout and specialized stores. You can duel in the arena, or build a car and head out on the highway. You can take courier missions. It's not a perfect game, but it really expanded my mind of what a game can be, and I had a fantastic time with it. And later, Games Workshop basically updated their BattleCars game with this one called Dark Future. This is the rule book here. Dark Future, Blood Red States, is a 2019 Windows game by Auroch Digital. And that same company in 2017 made an official adaptation of Steve Jackson's OGRE game. So there's another connection. The same company is back-to-back making games based on Steve Jackson Games, US, and Games Workshop, UK games. And one other little TSR connection, Steve Jackson US wrote books for TSR. Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, the UK, formed Games Workshop, and one of the very first things they did was they were the original European distributors for Dungeons & Dragons for TSR. In fact, that was a very big part of Games Workshop's early success, was selling Dungeons & Dragons in Europe. Okay, and one last thing. You may have noticed that some of the items I've shown shared the same artwork. And this is something I also noticed gradually over the years and started putting two and two together, and finally found out that the artist's name is Jim Burns. He's a very successful science fiction and fantasy artist with a very long career. This painting of his became the inspiration for the spinner vehicles in Blade Runner, for example. And he's done paintings for many science fiction authors that you may have read. I looked on my bookshelves quickly, and this Frederick Pohl book, O Pioneer, that's a Jim Burns painting there. But here in this collection of his art, Hyperluminal, are these two paintings. On the left, BattleCars, which was painted for Ian Livingstone in 1983. And here on the right, this one called Freeway Fighter, also for Ian Livingstone, also 1983. And this is when I finally noticed that these two paintings kept appearing on things I purchased. And I'll show you those right now. That blue car first appeared on BattleCars. This was the original commission. And then Battle Bikes. And of course, BattleCars for the Spectrum. And it also appeared on Games Workshop's White Dwarf magazine, issue 103. And then in the 2000, when Fighting Fantasy was getting reissued, they used it on the cover there. Although you notice that they changed the sky and edited out the guys with machine guns here. I kind of prefer it without them. And the last appearance I found was when Freeway Fighter was adapted into this comic book by Andy Ewington. Hi, Andy. We talk on Twitter sometimes. Here at the back of the book, they show the alternate covers. The Diamond UK cover is that blue car painting. And just to follow Jim Burns' red car painting, it first appeared on the Freeway Fighter Fighting Fantasy book, and also ended up on the Dark Future rule book. And here it is on the cover of a Psygnosis game, Nitro for the Amiga. I really love this game, which by the way was remade as Retro Racing by the original author a few years back. And finally, the red car got reused again on the Forbidden Planet cover variation of the Freeway Fighter comic. We've only just barely touched on the things that Steve Jackson and Steve Jackson have worked on over the years. These again are just some of my favorites. Let me know what your favorite Steve Jackson productions are, either US or UK. Again, this is an unusual topic for my channel. Back to more computer stuff next time. Thanks to my patrons for their support. Thank you for watching, and we'll talk to you next time.